Okay, ladies and gents, good afternoon to a very cold South Africa for those of you that are listening in from overseas. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes, and while people are still joining in, and before we introduce our speaker, I'm going to just mention a couple of things. This is another one of our Sundowner series webinars, and as a society, we are quite happy and quite proud of it. We've had activities virtually every month since our last Congress in July. Started fairly soon after that with our Sundowner webinar series. And apart from the webinars, we've also run a successful remote sensing course last month. And we're going to continue with our webinar series after our next conference. So our next conference is in July, and the webinar series will continue after that in August. And then we're going to continue running courses from time to time, like the remote sensing course that we ran last week or last month that was very successful. So for the society members, you can look forward to more activities over the next few months. And getting to this afternoon's webinar, as I said on the chat just now, it's freezing cold, certainly in Pietermaritzburg, and I'm sure it's cold over most of the country. I was supposed to be on a field trip to Cathedral Peak today, and the maximum temperature forecast for Cathedral Peak was going to be 0. So as a result of that, I'm sitting at home in my office. I see we've got quite a number of people that have joined already, and we're probably going to have a few more joining over the next few minutes, which is fine. And it's also nice to see a couple of international people who have joined in. We've got Andrew Ainsley from the UK, and from the US, from looking at the list quickly, we've got Urs Kreuter from Texas and Jonathan Spies from North Dakota. And I think we're probably having similar temperatures to what North Dakota experiences for most of the year. And Jonathan, good to see you. I think you've attended most of our webinars, or certainly quite a few of them, so welcome to you. Right, it is now 5 o'clock, and so we're going to get started as quickly as possible, and I'm sure we'll have a few more people joining us in the next couple of minutes. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Luthando Dziba. Now, his CV has been circulated along with the invitation to this webinar. And I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but I'll start at the bottom. Firstly, Luthando is a grassland scientist from the beginning. And he was educated in South Africa and also in the US. And he has a broad range of interest in the field of grassland science. He's worked on grasses, trees, forage, etc., and has a broad range of interests. He moved on to the CSIR and managed several ecosystem projects at the CSIR, including as diverse a project as biodiversity and ecosystem services, coastal systems, as well as earth observation. So from that, he's got a very broad experience and broad background in ecology and also in agriculture. And then he has moved up pretty quick through the ranks, and he's got very high level national and international experience at managing all sorts of things. So he has been a co-chair, or is a co-chair, of the multidisciplinary expert panel of the United Nations Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is quite a mouthful, but it's a very important body, and he plays a very important and a very strong role in that body. Then his current permanent position is the managing executive responsible for conservation services at SANParks, and that oversees all of scientific services, veterinary services, conservation planning, and cultural heritage. So that makes him quite a busy person. And at the moment, he is also the acting CEO of SANParks, which makes him even busier. So Luthando, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us on this very important topic of conservation, and particularly conservation in the midst of a pandemic, and looking at challenges and opportunities under these circumstances and in this environment. So Luthando, if you are ready, if you can start sharing your screen, and then we'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Kev. And again, as you mentioned, good afternoon to all of the colleagues. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can see that. Everything looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I want to thank the Grassland Society for the honor of this invitation. I think it is a great honor for me to be able to share in this seminar series, or like as you called it, Sundowner series of the GSSA. I really started my professional career within the GSSA. I recall, I think my first Congress was attending a meeting in Sidara. So I recognize many of the people that are here and appreciate the opportunity to share some reflections from working for a conservation agency during this time of a pandemic. I think in choosing this topic, I realized much later, which normally happens all the time to me, that perhaps I chewed or I bit more than I could chew. So please bear with me if I do go over a lot of information that sets the context, but also having to go through some of that information really fast. I think one of the things that I wanted to do was really to lay a foundation by reflecting more broadly on what I consider to be some of the key, emerging issues, globally with regards to biodiversity conservation and impacts on human well-being. And secondly, what I want to do then is to perhaps try to come down and reflect on some of the developments within a conservation agency like SANParks, especially in light of the impact of the pandemic on SANParks. I think one of the key findings of the IPBES assessment was that Africa is perhaps one of the only continents in the world with a relatively intact assemblage of its megaherbivores. And South Africa is home to many of these. And I think for us as a country, that is a privilege. It is something that has drawn people to South Africa for decades, and something that is equivalent perhaps in places like Europe to historic buildings and museums that people go to those places to see. When people come to Africa, they come to see Africa's natural and cultural beauty. And it is not just about animals and big things, but it is also about, plants, it is also about, how do we not just conserve species, but rather plan systematically in order to be able to ensure representation of, various biomes, various ecosystem types, and ensure that important plant and animal species are in a way conserved within the broader ecosystem approach. I think this figure sort of drives this message home about the unique place that we find ourselves in as a continent. In that unlike many other continents where a significant number of their megaherbivores have since gone extinct, if you look on the African continent and perhaps to some degree Southern Asia, you see that there is a significant proportion of our megaherbivores that have survived the late quaternary megaherbivore extinctions. And I think this is something to be proud of, but it is also something to cherish as we share this with the rest of the world. But what we have seen from recent reports consistently is that we are seeing an increase in the loss of biodiversity. We are seeing accelerated land degradation. We are also seeing with that a general decline, you know, in indicators of human well-being. And this is something that makes us to be very concerned, and particularly for the continent of Africa, because we know that, you know, any of the impacts on biodiversity that link directly to human well-being have dire consequences for humanity. And I don't think there's anything that could have driven that message home more than the current pandemic that we are experiencing. And I think it is not just IPBES, what we're seeing, for instance, this is a wide range of institutions that are undertaking these global assessments and finding relatively similar results. For instance, the Living Planet report or the Global Biodiversity Outlook also point to the same patterns. As you can see, like from the Living Planet report, you know, we are seeing a general decline in the Living Planet Index across many regions of the world. And if you look at Eurasia, the main reason really that in some of those areas we are not seeing as much decline is partly because, you know, they're moving from a relatively low base, to start with. And also when we look at, you know, most assessed categories of nature's vital attributes to people, you know, we see that they're declining, you know, globally, from since the 1970s. And the main driver really is overexploitation and land conversion. If you look, for instance, at the African Protected Area Population Index, this is basically the population of large mammals on the continent. It has declined by more than 50% from 1970. If you look sub-regionally, you see that there is differentiation, with some regions experiencing significant declines versus others. And what we see, interestingly, which I think speaks to this overexploitation, is that only the production of food, energy, and raw materials, you know, has increased, you know, in the last 100 years. And this is something that we see, you know, not just in distant places, but it does come even closer, or the impacts come quite close to us as well on the African continent. For instance, we are concerned in South Africa, with the decline in the African penguin population, and this has been happening at an accelerated rate, you know, since the 70s. It is said that at the turn of you know, the 20th century, in the early 1900s, you know, there were more than 1 million breeding pairs of penguins, of African penguins. And today we are around 13,000 breeding pairs of penguins. And so if this trajectory continues unabated, it is possible that this species will be functionally extinct within decades. And if you look also at our rhino population, you know, we're coming from over 10,000 rhino just within in SANParks only, to a point where we're around between 3,000 and 4,000 rhino. And that is basically, you know, a state-wide rhino in particular. I'm talking about white rhino. And when we look at southwestern black rhino, we see that these are rhino that are mainly in the other national parks except Kruger, that are growing at a slightly steady rate. But the south central black rhino, which is also a population that is mainly in the Kruger National Park, is declining. And this is basically a huge impact of poaching on rhino. And what I think is important, though, to note, when it's something that we are trying to make as a point, is that, you know, it is very difficult to manage and deal with poaching impacts in a large protected area like the Kruger National Park, with a high human density of more than 2 million people on the boundary of the national park. What we see as improvements, for instance, in the rhino population is that the rhino populations outside of Kruger National Park, in the smaller national parks where we are able to manage security better, we are able to manage access control, and we can basically be able to monitor the rhinos more closely over the entire area. We're able to see that the rhino population is growing at a decent rate there, but it doesn't compensate for the losses that we're suffering in Kruger because of the sheer numbers of the rhino that were in Kruger National Park. I think I'm making this point, broadly to just talk about, all of these declines and talk about them not just far, from a global, point of view or at a continental level, but to show that, we are experiencing declines in various areas as well, even within our own country, that we need to grapple with. One of the things, though, that is important to note, which I think I made a point of, is that there has been a steady increase, in food production since the 70s. In fact, food production has increased by 300% since 1970. Right now, about 33% of the world's land surface and 75% of freshwater resources are devoted to crop or livestock production. 15% increase in global per capita consumption of materials, since 1980. And yet, about 11% of the world population is still considered undernourished. And so I think what this speaks to is that even though we are seeing a general decline, in ecosystem services or nature's contributions to people, we actually seeing a world that is becoming increasingly unequal, even though more connected. This figure is showing that, generally over the last 50 years or so, we have basically seen a decline in almost, I would say 80% of nature's contributions to people, whether it is the regulating services or material or services or non-material services. There has been a general decline. In fact, it is the material services such as energy, food, and also materials and medicines or medicinal plants and other genetic resources that have actually been on the increase. And this is basically speaking to our overexploitation of these resources from the environment. And what is driving this is mainly that, if you look at that figure, under direct drivers, it is land and sea use change. So land use change, sea use change, direct exploitation of resources, climate change, pollution, invasive alien species. And if you look at, the indirect drivers, which are mainly influenced by social values, it is demographic and social-cultural changes. For instance, if you look at the continent of Africa, the population of Africa is estimated to double by 2050. And if the population doubles, it means there will be more demand for resources. And that basically means that there will be a need to produce those resources by converting more land for agriculture and also over exploitation of resources. Economic and technological advances have also made it easy to be able to exploit resources. Poor governance and institutions, make it easy for, lawlessness to thrive in ways that people exploit resources without, accounting properly for the overexploitation of resources. And this is not just at the level of individuals, even at the level of corporations. And again, conflicts and epidemics, definitely being some of the key underpinning direct drivers and indirect drivers of change. What we see, like, I mean, and what we are arguing as a protected area agency is that national parks make an immense contribution to biodiversity conservation and to ecosystem services. They offer a unique opportunity to conserve underrepresented species, rare species, as well as cultural heritage that is of unique and outstanding universal value. And they also, I think, present opportunities for working with communities. I haven't put here in a great detail, but you know, in the Eastern Cape, we are working around the Rhodes, Maclear area, and we are looking at establishing a new Grassland National Park, in addition to Golden Gate National Park, because grasslands are underrepresented among protected areas. And we are looking not at a traditional approach to establishing, you know, a national park, which is to move people. Historically, we moved people and we basically fenced in areas and put in animals, and that is, you know, was the sort of colonial era type of establishing protected areas. But what we are now looking at is looking at how do we collaborate between, you know, a conservation, a public entity that is a conservation agency, working with private sector, working with communities, particularly land under traditional authority, and ensuring, you know, this mixed model to deliver conservation services, ecosystem services that arise from conservation. And they may not be like, the typical big five conservation areas, but may contribute to conservation, for instance, of water resources, and ensuring that, you know, landscapes that we see as key to, you know, water, you know, resources or water conservation, and there's high water factors, those, you know, landscapes remain relatively intact. And I think that this is something that perhaps is going to shift how we think about, you know, which areas do we identify as important for conservation. So SANParks is a national agency, one of many that manages several protected areas around the country. We manage over 4.4 million hectares in 20 national parks, and we also have new national parks. I don't know if many people know, but we are managing the land that belongs to the Square Kilometre Array project of the National Research Foundation, which is a global project. And we are now looking at exploring establishing a Grassland National Park in the Eastern Cape, which, if all successful, will be the 21st you know, national park in our stable of national parks. But as you can see, like, our national parks are distributed across the country, but we have few that, you know, in terms of size, are quite significant, such as the Kruger and Kgalagadi in the Kgalagadi Transfrontier Conservation Area. We employ more than, you know, 5,700 people mixed between permanent and temporary staff. But on any given day, more than 12,000 people work in our national parks. So national parks are quite key, not just to conservation, but also to socio-economic development within the areas where they occur. SANParks also manages a number of marine protected areas. And when the minister a few years ago declared, you know, an additional 20 marine protected areas, a few were given to SANParks, such as Namakwa, Robben Island, and also the Addo Elephant Marine Protected Area. This declaration increased South Africa's, you know, sea area under marine protected areas from 0.4% to about 5%. And I think that was a significant contribution to conservation. And I think it presents unique opportunities and challenging on its own. I had promised that I would reflect briefly on how national parks were also impacted by COVID. We did look at the impacts of COVID, particularly on the well-being of employees at SANParks. We also reflected on how COVID impacted our scientists who normally would be out and about in our national parks, collecting data, doing monitoring work, and supporting research within national parks. We took time to reflect on these in a special issue of biological conservation, which was published earlier this year, and many of these papers that go with this one that we published are actually available online. What I think we reflected on were sort of three core principles that underpin sustainability within the context of protected areas. One, like I think the obvious one being social intactness, and I think I've reflected on that ecological intactness that we always sort of strive to fulfill as a responsibility in protected areas. But there's also the sort of social relevance of national parks, where questions exist about what is the meaning and benefit of having these protected areas when especially people who are poor live around them. How do they benefit from national parks? But I think what really struck us this year was the fact that tourism was quite central to the sustainability of national parks in South Africa, because tourism basically underpins the financial viability of national parks, which basically enables us to do what we do. Previously, that is before COVID, in the 2019-2020 financial year, we generated over 2.2 billion rands in revenue from tourism-related activities, and we received an amount that amounts to about 20% of that as government grant. So tourism enabled SANParks to be able to fulfill its public good mandate without necessarily depending on government funding, and that changed quite significantly with COVID, because we were not able to generate near what we are normally able to, and I will reflect very briefly on that. COVID also impacted on staff wellness. It impacted on our ability to conduct research and monitoring. And so perhaps if I were to just sum up, in terms of challenges, we definitely saw a significant decline in the number of visitors and tourism revenue associated with the pandemic. Before the pandemic, as I indicated, we made over 2 billion rands, and we had over 7 million visitors to our national parks. And when COVID hit, basically, we basically were in the dark, I think, for most of last year, as far as how things would look like and how tourism would look like post-COVID. But we're pleased to say that we have seen some recovery as people longed to go out and get out to national parks and reconnect with nature, even with a decline in visitor numbers, a decline in revenue, and really a stronger focus in the public good mandate. We have reason to be quite hopeful going forward, provided obviously that things such as the third wave, our vaccination program, the vaccination programs in other countries that are contributing to our visitor numbers, start to work well. I think second challenge really was this question around work-life balance, especially as people needed to work from home. There was a major adjustment, I think, by all businesses, which was prompted by the pandemic. We shifted from working from office to meetings like what we are having now. But in order to be able to do that, most organizations, needed to prepare for over a very short period of time. I remember in SANParks, you know, many people would not mind having, for instance, desktops only and work, you know, a sort of 8 to 5 job and leave their office and go home and have, another, like, I mean, life, connect with family and unwind and so on. But, you know, having, to have laptops organized on short notice, internet access, and other people would say, yeah, I mean, I can take the laptop and maybe the 3G card that you're giving me or 4G card that you're giving me, but I don't have an office to work from. And I live with, you know, so many other people from home. So it's not an ideal work environment. And I think that, you know, these were challenges that we had not anticipated. So we asked a few scientists within SANParks to reflect on these. And I think many reflected on new skills that they learned. For instance, instead of printing, of publishing and getting consultants to publish our annual report, we had colleagues that actually did learned, you know, online courses on desktop publishing and published our annual research report, you know, ourselves. Many colleagues had time for what we call deep work, which was more reflective work about the science that we do, but also opportunities to write. And also, I think we saw many, you know, using various online tools such as Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and so on for meetings. And we see a lot of possibilities for longer term use of some of those tools going forward. But there were also, like, you know, these negative impacts, such as lack of field work, lack of face-to-face time, many people sort of struggling to juggle, you know, work and family, and huge concerns around job security, especially for a tourism-dependent organization such as ourselves. You know, these are just a few of the reflections. And I think if you look at some of the positive things, I mean, it was a highly productive year for many people in terms of the time for deep work. And we see that in the number of publications that has increased, you know, from the previous financial year to the current financial year, especially for our internal staff. We've seen many, you know, reports and strategies and other key, documents, you know, that inform our work, you know, like being produced during a time that, you know, perhaps was much quicker than would be possible when we had travel and other things. I think another opportunity was, you know, opportunities to reach out to communities, especially reaching out to the needy that are living near our national parks. SANParks delivered, you know, thousands of food parcels to communities or to households that were needy, working with social developments and local, you know, leaders to identify people living near our national parks. And I think this was quite, you know, impactful. And it was something that we had not planned, and we didn't know how to do it. And when we started doing it, we then had partners, for instance, such as the Sia Kolisi Foundation, Pick and Pay, you know, honorary rangers coming on board and providing additional resources for us to be able to reach out to even more households. For instance, around ADO, like the program supported households for a period of 6 months, providing them with basically a food parcel that is equivalent to about 1,000 rands a month for a couple of, you know, dozen households. And I think that is quite significant. We also saw, like, I mean, many opportunities for our colleagues who were involved in essential services, you know, but it was not many people, because many of us could not really get out and be about and go about our work. But groups that were involved in capture and translocation of animals were very busy during the full lockdown. So I think we have this hope that national parks will maintain their place as places of healing and rejuvenation, and will remain relevant long after the pandemic. But I think, you know, what we saw really requires reflection is, you know, funding models. How do we fund, you know, this public good mandate that we have to deliver as a conservation agencies? Are there ways for us to rethink this, and what are the new innovative approaches that must be considered, including social impact bonds, which are basically investments in communities in order to enhance conservation outcomes within protected areas, conservation bonds, where we get investments into conservation and derive benefit from people who want to see successful conservation outcomes, including, for instance, rhino, elephant, or any other species of interest to investors. So these are some of the things that we are now sort of looking at as part of the ways of saying, how do we diversify income streams? How do we diversify, funding models for conservation? With that, I want to end and hope we can have, or I've shared enough to allow us to have a good discussion. Thank you very much, Kev.
Luthando, thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. Wow, a lot of different impacts. So I'd like to invite the audience to submit questions. You can either raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can ask live, or please feel free to type your question into the chat box and I'll work through those. So if I could perhaps kick off, during the pandemic, we saw a lot of improvements in environmental conditions. So the air improved, water's improved, but it's a very short-lived improvement in the environment, and the economic fallout from the pandemic is such that the pressure to revive economies is, I feel, going to really drive a much stronger impact on the environment. So we had business as usual, we then had a hiatus. How do we now change business as usual? We saw all those amazing figures or scary figures of the declines in animal numbers and biodiversity. How do we change the business as usual? Luthando, you muted.
Thanks. I didn't realize you were done, Debbie. Thank you. I mean, it's a very good question. You're correct to say first that I mean, there was excitement about footage of animals roaming around, for instance, roads or even in urban areas, people seeing wild animals that were roaming. We know that that was very short-lived. I think that, countries need to think very deep about, how do we recover, post, the pandemic. And I think some of the opportunities that exist is that with a lot of the stimulus funding that is being invested now in recovery by governments needs to look at, green investment opportunities. For instance, in the case of national parks, when we're getting funding, we need to be looking at, where do we invest, this funding, or how do we invest this funding in order to improve, for instance, the climate resilience of our, tourism infrastructure and other infrastructure within national parks. I don't know if you recall late in the rainy season with huge floods in Mpumalanga that impacted on Kruger, we saw bridges and other infrastructure just being washed away. And so, the question is, if those, events are going to be increasing in frequency and in severity over time due to climate change, how do we invest in the type of infrastructure that is more resilient to such, impacts? And I think that we have an opportunity to think like that and to perhaps pursue such investments, post-COVID.
Thank you. We have a question from Mark. Please go ahead, Mark.
Thanks, Debbie. Hi, Luthando. This is a tricky question, but I'm hoping you're wanting to engage in a robust discussion. Even though there was some parliamentary focus on it last year, looking at the adequacy of funding to national parks, in fact, to protected areas in general, it still seems that we massively under-resource our conservation agencies across the country. And in fact, SANParks' success at tourism revenue generation, I think, has actually led it into a position of real vulnerability. How can we recalibrate the government investment? Do we have a costing for what it would take to run all parks, and especially new parks, optimally, even just to make them compliant with alien laws and fire laws, et cetera, et cetera? And how do we profile sound environmental management to reduce the costs to the fiscus? You know, the fire on Table Mountain caused a lot more damage than the entire annual grant from central government. How do we really move that recalibration forward, and how does this bigger community help you do that?
Thanks, Mark. I mean, very tricky question indeed. I think, I mean, one of the things that we, a few years ago, had opportunity to do was to travel with the Minister of Public Works and also the to Egypt during one of the COP, CBD COP, meetings, and I think during that meeting there were a few opportunities to talk about, how can we use ecological infrastructure to increase the resilience of, engineered infrastructure, among other, discussions we had. And I think we saw that there was some kind of dawn in the minds about, that if, for instance, we invested more, in biodiversity, in ecosystem management, in ecological infrastructure, that there could be opportunities, for saving, government, resources by not just being reactionary to, for instance, disasters. And I think that I don't think we have enough opportunities for driving that message home. For instance, if you look, last year's SANParks got help from government, but that was, temporary support. And so if you look at, going forward, how do we make the case not just for SANParks, but for management of conservation, and not just only within protected areas, but management of landscapes broadly in manner or in a way that basically enables us to mitigate some of the impacts, of some of these extreme events that are likely going to increase. So I think that we do need to work across, disciplines more, and I think we need to get, some of our, especially Treasury, Public Works, Transport, Infrastructure, Energy, ministries to have a much deeper appreciation of how the work that we do, in the environment sector, can actually contribute to reducing, the overall burden on the state. If you look at water pollution, you look at air pollution, and you look at the impacts that they have on health and well-being, and then the amount of money now we have to spend, on the health system in order to deal with those ailments that are as a result of the original, degradation of ecosystems and ecosystem services. I think, to me, that is an irony that we need to be able to talk about and bring forth in a much more clearer way than we are able to do, or we have been able to do before. And I don't think it's the ministers of environment that are going to be driving that message. I think the world over, it's clear that it actually takes, a much more integrated approach to thinking about development and planning in order to be able to achieve, that kind of, of rethinking within government.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Urs. Please go ahead.
Yes, thanks. Good morning, Luthando. Thanks for that presentation. Sort of to follow on from the previous question, particularly with the sort of meltdown of the tourism industry, what kind of models is SANParks looking at, you know, to substitute or complement anticipated increase in revenue from tourism again? International tourism is probably going to take some time, but you know, there's some other possibilities, and I think particularly in terms of public-private partnerships. And I mean, there's already, you know, a lot of support provided by volunteer organizations such as the Honorary Rangers. But if it was more formalized in terms of public-private partnerships where private corporations could get some sort of a tax break or some other incentive in terms of conservation benefits that they could offset against, you know, pollution that they might be creating. Have any of those sort of measures been considered?
Thanks, S, and good morning to you too. I think we have, I mean, SANParks has had opportunity to work with the private sector in some respects, and perhaps the concessionaires are basically more in the you know, ecotourism space, just like we are. But I think one of the things that happened during the pandemic, in fact, at the height of the pandemic, was that we started getting approaches from investors who are interested, or who are working with people that are interested in particular outcomes, and hence that discussion about social impact bonds and also green bonds or conservation bonds. For instance, we recently signed a project that is in excess of 100 million rands with the World Bank and other like development banks to basically where they will spend, you know, funding based on, you know, the growth in the population of rhino, for instance, in Ado and the Eastern Cape, and for every, like, I mean, percentage growth, there is a committed amount of money that will be invested in the national parks that are contributing to rhino conservation in the Eastern Cape. And I think, you know, these are some of the more, like, I mean, you know, innovative finance mechanisms that we think will be key going forward. But we also think that there is opportunity for looking at creating space for instance, developers to actually develop key infrastructure, but in a way that allows them to derive revenue from that infrastructure. It doesn't have to be hotels and other, like, you know, tourism products. For instance, if you can have, and I'm giving this as an hypothetical example, a company that says that we can actually develop, you know, an automated, you know, gate entrance system, and we would like to manage that and take that as a concession, you know, like, I mean, from SANParks, and we will pay a percentage, or, like, I mean, that we agree upon, you know, and I think we can see particular developments, or we can develop a particular, like, let's say, for instance, a solar power plant, or, you know, so that we can get this national park off the grid. We will contribute, SANParks will pay a particular rate for energy, maybe that is cheaper than Eskom, and then any excess energy we will sell to neighboring communities. So I think we're looking at opportunities that are much more, you know, unconventional, for instance, from the way we have been doing things before. And I think that it's going to take a bit of rethinking about, you know, what is possible as a way of ensuring that, you know, a protected area agency such as SANParks is able to be much more financially sustainable in the post-COVID, you know, era.
Thank you for that. Just a follow-up question from Mark. He's saying, are we ready with the arguments and numbers if Treasury and the Department of Public Works gives us protected area managers an audience? And do we have support in cabinet to really recalibrate the budgets? And how do we use the rationalization process to help with this and not to further weaken conservation? So I think he's putting the onus on us. Are we ready?
Yeah, okay. I think, I mean, it's a question perhaps for all of us, you know, in terms of, you know, are we ready? I think we have some of these numbers. I remember, like, I mean, I think it's the Natural Capital Accounting project that is led by SANParks and Stats SA, and it has come up with some really interesting figures, even about the contribution of the biodiversity sector to jobs, which before we used to think that mines, for instance, contribute more to employment than, you know, the conservation sector, and now we know that they actually contribute about the same. And I think it now basically changes the discussion about, you know, job creation. So if, for instance, you said, but this place is important for biodiversity and for water, I think we can make a stronger argument than previously when, for instance, mines would say, we will create 4,000 jobs in this area, you know. And I think that, to me, these are some of the numbers we need to be able to generate and produce. And I think we need to consolidate that across the country and across different landscapes. The water source areas, you know, project as well was quite key to giving us light, for instance, to the fact that, you know, about an area of about, you know, 10% of the, you know, land surface of the country, you know, produces more than 70% of the water, like, I mean, that we use in the country. And also, like, the making the case for biodiversity project. So I think we're needing to continue in these efforts and not make them short-term projects, and synthesize that information and make it more publicly available, because I think that, you know, we have an opportunity to, when we have audience with key departments, to be able to share some of this information in a more succinct way. The rationalization project, I hope, will help with consolidating resources, but I'm not too sure if it will actually, you know, enhance, you know, funding for conservation. I wish it would, because, you know, but I think, you know, we probably need to look at what is the, or what are some of the models that would be looked at consolidating some of the funding. I think there was an over reliance on, I don't know if it's reliance, over reliance, I think, on the SANParks model as a successful model. And I think people came all over the world to see that. And I think COVID exposed, you know, like, I mean, the weaknesses of that model. And I think we're needing to think about, you know, how do we diversify, you know, funding models that will enable us to ensure that conservation is funded sustainably going forward.
Those are good points. Thank you. Sonalo has posed a very interesting question. Are there any measures being taken in trying to understand the ecological integrity of our protected areas based on the intactness of these areas at, say, regional scales?
Wow. I mean, interesting question. I think, I mean, we are trying, obviously, like, I can't say at regional scales. And I think, for instance, if you look at the IPBES assessment, I mean, ecosystem assessment for Africa, I mean, when IPBES launched that assessment, it also launched other assessments in the Americas, in Asia Pacific, in Europe and Central Asia. And I think it was to gain a regional perspective of the state of biodiversity. It was not necessarily protected areas. There are agencies or institutions such as the IUCN that tend to look at protected areas specifically. And I think there are models, or there are approaches they use to understand, you know, ecological integrity of protected areas. One thing that is positive, I think, is that perhaps if you look at all of the, IEG biodiversity targets that were set up to 2020 by the CBD, you see that actually only, well, one of the few that was achieved was actually the declaration of protected areas, and that was true for Africa as well. But I think the question that remains is whether these are just paper parks or are they indeed, effectively managed. And so, tools such as the management effectiveness tracking tool for national parks, or for protected areas, are tools that are used to do these assessments, and state of biodiversity assessments and other, assessments that are done and reported on by conservation agencies, I think contribute to basically the question that Sinalo is asking.
Yes, thank you very much for that. The last question has been withdrawn. So are there any other questions? Now is your chance. One from Mr. Nondlazi. Thank you for that presentation, Luthando. Regarding management of vegetation and parks in general, would you say the pandemic and the fourth industrial revolution technologies have had an impact in how the agency plans to manage parks in the management model in the future? Would these impacts affect employment negatively or positively? And how would conservation change for the benefit and resilience of communities? Wow, there's a good question.
Yeah, thanks, Basanda. I mean, very rich question. I don't think I'm going to be able to answer all of the components of that question effectively, but I think, the pandemic has definitely had a significant impact on national parks. One of the things that, continues to be a challenge is the tourism part. But I think, generally speaking, we have seen that, with the pandemic, there has also been, greater caution about, what is the impact of, zoonotic diseases, for instance, on domestic animals and food security. And we're seeing a huge caution around, the risks that are associated, for instance, with, with diseases that are of animal origin. And if you look at many of the pandemics that affect humans, I think about 80% of them actually are zoonosis, and I think zoonotic, and I think that is basically something that perhaps could be the longer term impact. The caution about the potential use even of meat products and other animal derived products for human consumption. The industrial revolution and technologies, it's something that we've explored quite a bit, but not necessarily to perhaps greater effect as maybe some agencies have done. For instance, people from Europe have actually enjoyed game drives on a daily basis, by just watching a channel on DSTV or streaming online. And so they might not have necessarily missed, coming and visiting Africa because we've taken Africa to them, and I think those are some of the opportunities that technology has brought. But I think within the context of the management of national parks, I think there's huge opportunities that exist for technologies. And SANParks, we have huge experience, especially with anti-poaching technologies from sensors and other integrated technology platforms. We also have the same from a safety and security point of view, where we look at drones, we look at cameras that are fixed points, integrated, in a system that allows us to be able to see basically around an entire national park from an office and be able to deploy rangers, to sites that we see as sites at risk. So I think we do have you know, opportunities that we are using already, but I don't think they are near anywhere to where perhaps we could achieve, you know, full application. I think the opportunities are there actually for some of these to create jobs, especially for younger people who are much more tech savvy than, you know, our generation. So I already belong to a generation that is getting to be out of date with technologies. And so I think, you know, we're needing to look at opportunities for that. We're actually even thinking about places within national parks. In fact, of rolling out Wi-Fi access within national parks in order to attract young people to just visit national parks, even not just for jobs. And similarly with communities, we actually realize that national parks actually, you know, I mean, communities are quite integral to the existence and continued existence of national parks, and we are always continually exploring ways of ensuring that communities meaningfully benefit from the existence of national parks and feel ownership of national parks that they live next to, so that they don't see, you know, tourists who parachute in and out and experiencing great, you know, like, I mean, tourism experiences within national parks and leave a few $100 and a few dollars. And we think that there needs to be more to explore around, you know, meaningful integration and ownership by communities of protected areas and of benefits that derive from protected areas. Thank you very much.
Great answer. Thank you very much. Just a comment from Tony Palmer. He says, excellent perspective. That is something that really needs to be dealt with cautiously. And on that positive note, and with no more questions, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and input. And I'd like to hand you back to Kevin now. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thanks, Debbie, for handling the questions very professionally. And Luthando, many thanks for making the time to give us this really insightful talk. It's been really interesting and given us a really good perspective on what's happening with SANParks. I think as a society, we're very proud that one of our own is in a real position of influence in South Africa and in SANParks. So thank you for that. And I think all of us are also very encouraged by the fact that there is consideration for a new Grassland National Park. And I'm quite sure that that'll be a really innovative way that a park is introduced and run. So we're all looking forward to seeing how that is done. And so thank you very much for that. But Luthando, thanks very much for that talk. I know you're a very busy person. Thank you very much for making the time. And as a society, we would really like to stay in touch with you, and hopefully we'll see you at some of our congresses in the near future.
Thank you very much, Kev.
Yesterdays when you used to attend our congresses on a regular basis. So thank you very much for that. And to the audience, thank you very much for attending. For those of you in the audience who are attending our Congress next month, we have had a really high number of submissions for presentations, and we'd like all of you to register and also pay as soon as possible, please. So that's just a little bit of housekeeping. But thank you very much, and we'll see many of you at our Congress next week, and the next webinar will be in August after the Congress is over and done with. So thanks a lot, and once again, thank you very much.